Welcome to Flower of Life podcast. I'm Carmen Fernandez. Today we're going to talk about health and nutrition. Because in the times that we're going through now, people are more concerned about their health. People are starting to realize that what we eat has an impact on our physical and mental health. And people want to be more responsible and want to know more about how they can improve their health, strengthen their immune system, have a good mood, just by changing the way they eat. Today, I'm with Dr. David Harper. David has studied the impact of diet on human health for many years. He is professor of kinesiology at University of the Fraser Valley. He is a scientist at the BC Cancer Research Centre. He has a PhD from University of British Columbia. He's post-doctoral in comparative physiology at University of Cambridge. He's on the scientific advisory board of the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition. He's also a member of the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. And the culmination of his work is Biodiet, a nutrition plan to improve health and reverse any damage caused. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm always a little humbled by those introductions. I guess once you've been around a while, like I have, you develop a few credentials, but it's a pleasure to be on the show with you, Carmen, and to meet you on Zoom as we do these days.
Thank you, David. I'm very grateful for having you here today. And well, you have spent your whole life studying nutrition. How is that you are so passionate about nutrition and health?
Yeah, actually, minor correction there. I'm a biologist by training. I did my undergraduate and graduate work here at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where I live, and then went off to Woods Hole and then Cambridge University. And I was studying comparative physiology. So human health I've studied all my life, and I've taught at the university level all my life. But it was about 10 years ago when I met a fellow named Dr. Richard Matthias, who had spent his career looking at the therapeutic benefits of nutrition. And he was focusing on the First Nations diet in Canada and the North. And he's the one that sort of took me down the rabbit hole of ketogenic diets and taught me that, in fact, the ancestral diet, our natural human diet before agriculture was in fact a ketogenic diet. It's our natural healthy state. And as we return to that now with modern tools of cellular and molecular biology, now that we can do clinical trials in a robust evidence-based way, we have this growing body of evidence that indicates that ketogenic diets are a very effective and powerful therapeutic to address metabolic disease. And when I say metabolic disease, that's sort of a general term that refers to increased obesity, especially mid-abdominal obesity, like the pot belly, and high blood sugar, unregulated blood sugar, which can lead to diabetes, and in inflammation. So I actually have a sort of slightly different model that I present in the book Biodiet that I've written, and I call it the axis of illness. It was sort of a takeoff on George Bush and his axis of evil. So the axis of illness, to me, if you look at chronic disease, and these are Western diseases that plague the Western world. So the most common diseases are heart disease and cardiovascular disease, including strokes, cancer, diabetes now, and Alzheimer's disease. These are all really lifestyle diseases that are very closely correlate with poor diet. And when I mean poor diet, that's a diet that is high in sugar and other high glycemic index foods like, breads and pastas and so on. This high carbohydrate, low fat diet that we've been told to eat by our, policymakers and government for decades now. It turns out there was never really any evidence to support that. It was more industry lobbyists, and we were trying to get people to eat what we were growing or raising. But if we look at it now with these new tools of science, we can see that for most people, and when I say most people, you're in Ireland, I'm in Canada, We can include, all of the UK as well. We can include the United States. We can include Australia and so on. There's this sort of epidemic rates of obesity and the associated metabolic disease, which in the axis of illness, that to me is obesity, insulin resistance, which leads to that high blood sugar, and inflammation, which is at the root cause of cardiovascular disease. So the those three things are responsible for about 70% of all chronic disease, and are, what we're treating in hospitals and what we're treating through medications and so on. It's just such a burden on society, and a complicating burden for COVID-19, as you see those same elements of the axis of illness are what create these poor outcomes in COVID-19. So yes, to answer your question, I've been interested in this in a long time. You can see I'm very passionate about it. But about 10 years now, I've been researching the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets for chronic disease, and specifically with my work at the BC Cancer Research Center. We do what's called immunohistochemistry. So we look at the cellular mechanisms of the innate immune system, the inflammatory response in particular, and how that affects cancer. And that's the study we're doing now as part of a 3-year study in cooperation with Dr. Jeff Volek's lab. I should mention at the BC Cancer Research Center, I work with Dr. Gerald Crystal, who's kind of a rock star in cancer research. And then we've teamed up with another rock star, Dr. Jeff Volek. He's a rock star in ketogenic therapies, and they're at The Ohio State University. And we're doing a 3-year study to investigate the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets for women with metastatic breast cancer. And some of that was presented in a talk I gave recently in Denver, at Low Carb Denver. So if people wanted to have a quick look at that, they could just Google my name, Harper, and keto in Denver, and that should pop up for you.
Oh, great. Most people only look for nutrition advice when they want to lose weight. But eating has a very big impact on our health, on our physical and mental health. Can you talk a little bit about this? How eating has an impact on our health, and what is healthy eating from your opinion?
That's the question, really, isn't it? Because there's all kinds of different opinions out there, and the problem is, people turn to the internet, and what pops up is not necessarily the best evidence. The best evidence is coming from the research. So, I present that. If people want to follow me on Facebook, I think it's Dave Harper. It's David G. Harper on LinkedIn, and I post stuff all the time, the latest research in nutrition. And yeah, there's I think it was 2016 or 17 comprehensive global study that was published in the very prestigious journal, The Lancet, which is a British publication. And that demonstrated that the global burden of chronic disease, so not infectious disease, but chronic disease, if you look at the lifestyle factors that undermine our health in terms of chronic disease, nutrition is the most important. Not only is it the most important, but it's more important than alcohol. It's more important than smoking. It's more important than sedentary behavior and lack of exercise. All of those combined. So in fact, as I like to say, the most important health decision you make every day is what's on the end of your fork. And so what the research is showing now is that food can be used as medicine. That if you have chronic disease issues, many of these conditions, most of them, about 70% of chronic disease is due to, again, these elements of the axis of illness. Those can be reversed, and often quite quickly. So there is a drug-free way to address this, and that's through healthy eating.
Food is medicine.
Food is medicine, yes, and there's many quotes about it, but the opposite is also true. Is poor diet equals poor health.
Yes,
and
of course.
We have a couple of adages we use. Some people think, well, I exercise a lot, so I'm just going to eat whatever I want and drink too much and that sort of thing. We say, no, you can't outrun your fork. You can't. Yes. All the exercise in the world is not going to make up for a poor diet. And if you continue with a poor diet, eventually, I actually think all of these chronic diseases I've mentioned, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, I think they're all related, and they're all due to poor metabolism that's a result of poor diet.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean about, what do you mean with poor metabolism is a result of it? Poor metabolism is a result of of a poor diet. Is that what you said?
That's right. Yeah. So when we talk about metabolic disease and those things
Mm-hmm.
that contribute to it, um, there's also something called metabolic syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
which you throw in what we call dyslipidemia, which was your good cholesterol is too low and your triglycerides, your fats in your blood are too high. So you add that in, then you have metabolic disease, and metabolic disease, will eventually lead to type 2 diabetes and/or
Mm-hmm.
cancer and/or cardiovascular disease. And in fact, we now think of Alzheimer's disease as a type 3 diabetes. So all of these are metabolic as opposed to, say, genetic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there is a huge genetic component, of course. Your susceptibility to both acute and chronic disease is going to be somewhat dependent on the genes that you're given from your parents. But lifestyle has a huge impact on that. And again, most important of that is nutrition. So when you eat the present recommended diet in the West, which is a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, that is not a natural human diet. It's not our ancestral diet. It is the diet we've been eating for 10,000 years. So if you talk about, you're Spanish, I'm Canadian, you have your high carb foods that you eat and your sweet foods that you eat. And, in Canada, we have our macaroni and cheese and our pancakes and all that. So that all tastes good. And we have the notion that, a little bit now and then is okay. But in fact, the people don't do that a little bit now and then. They do it all the time. And so what we do now is we chronically eat a diet high in carbohydrate and low in fat. And that's what we've been told to do. What that does, carbohydrate really comes in sugars or complex carbohydrates, which are like starches and fiber. And of those, only the fiber really is beneficial. You don't need to eat any carbohydrate. You don't need to consume any of it. There are no essential carbohydrates in our diet. But that's where we get usually 2/3 to 3/4 of our calories is from that. And so what that does, all of that, aside from the fiber, turns into sugar in your blood sugar or glucose. And when you eat a whole lot of it, your blood sugar levels rise very rapidly. And then what happens is your body has to clear that sugar out of the blood because those are dangerously high levels. And it does so by releasing a very powerful hormone, perhaps the most powerful hormone, called insulin. And insulin has many effects. And one of them is to take that sugar out of the blood and deposit it into the muscles and the fat tissue, and where it can be stored or used as a fuel. And the problem with that is when you're chronically eating a diet high in carbohydrate, you're chronically over secreting insulin. And we call that hyperinsulinemia, which means too much insulin in the blood. And over time, that hyperinsulinemia will eventually affect the receptors on those cells that allow the cells to absorb the sugar from the blood. We call this insulin resistance. And the effect on the receptors, we call that downregulation. In other words, because there's so much insulin in the blood, the cells become less responsive to it. And so in order for our bodies to get that sugar out, it now has to secrete more insulin. And then the cells become more resistant to it and more. And so over a period of maybe, it can happen more quickly, but typically over the period of a decade or so, we become insulin resistant. And your physician will see that in your blood work as a rising fasting level of blood glucose. So that's a metabolic response to that chronically high diet. Now, high insulin resistance and the high consumption of carbohydrate, that carbohydrate that can't be burned turns into fat. So now you have the insulin resistance, and elevated levels of sugar in the blood also cause inflammation in the blood. It's a little more complicated if you want to talk about that. But you have these three elements of the axis of illness. Think of a triangle with obesity on the bottom, insulin resistance at the top, and inflammation on the other side. And all of those three metabolic conditions make each other worse. So you get this vicious circle, or we call it positive feedback in physiology. And that will just get worse and worse and worse until eventually you'll get cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, or all of them, because we call them comorbidities. And just a sort of current addition to that is all of those conditions are also the ones that are creating the worst outcomes for COVID-19. And so if we can reverse those conditions, and we can with the ketogenic diet, for most people, I should mention, ketogenic diets aren't for everyone. There are some medical contraindications. They're rare, but you need to discuss that with your physician, and you should never make it's a significant metabolic change. So you should never make that change without consulting with your physician. But assuming it is, and about 7 out of 8 people respond positively, you can reverse those conditions, and sometimes very quickly. Typically within a month or so, you'll see great improvements. You'll start losing body fat. Your blood sugar will start to regulate. Your inflammatory markers in your blood will go down. Your other biomarkers like your blood pressure and so on will improve. And we see this time and time again. It's very consistent. There's very, very good long-term, robust science to support this. So that's how making this change in your diet from going from we should probably talk about what a ketogenic diet is, but
Yes.
shifting from this high carbohydrate diet to a very low carbohydrate diet, in fact, almost a no carbohydrate diet outside of fiber, that's what allows you to make this metabolic improvement.
So you reduced your carbohydrates intake and you increased your fat intake.
Yeah,
right?
and there's only 3 macronutrients that give us our calories. The third being proteins. There are other nutrients, vitamins and minerals, and even water. But those are the 3 macronutrients where we get our calories from. And protein, there is no safe upper limit that's been identified for protein. But in practical terms, between 25 and 30% of your calories is probably a good maximum. After that, you start to run into some complications. So if you're taking, if you have those 3 things, and your protein in the middle here is like 25%, and you're taking the carbohydrate, which was maybe 70%, out 60 or 70% down to less than 5%, then you have to compensate by eating more fat. And so we've been told to fear fat. We've been told to hate fat and all these low fat products. All of that, and very supported by the processed food industry, who love to give people high carbohydrate foods that have lots of sugar in them because we'll eat them. In fact, they design those foods so we can't stop eating them, which is, borderline criminal in my mind.
Yes.
But when people worry about adding fats, but there are some bad fats. Trans fats, for example, are not healthy. Although if they're occurring in natural living things, they're okay. There are trans fats in meats and things, but they're okay. But the artificial trans fats are not good. But there's this great fear of saturated fat, and saturated fat is, most people think of that associated with animals, but there's also saturated fats in plants. Those fats there's never, if you look at the research about this, you'll see that there isn't any conclusive, robust science that proves that eating more saturated fat will cause more heart disease. That's the argument. It's always been saturated fat causes heart disease. It doesn't. I can tell you, I've looked for 10 years for any shred of evidence that saturated fats cause heart disease. Saturated fats in combination with a high carbohydrate diet, that's a separate issue. But on their own, saturated fats do not cause heart disease. And so you can eat all the butter. I like grass-fed butter because it's high in omega-3 fatty acids. You can eat the fat on your steak. I like eating grass-fed beef that's organically raised and humanely raised. And then there's, the monounsaturated fats like like olive oil, and then other like
coconut oil.
Yeah, the nut oils. So all the nut oils like avocado oil, macadamia oil, they're all good. I don't think that seed oils are healthy. I think they're highly inflammatory. So all of those cheap seed oils, including corn oil that they use in a lot of processed foods, are actually highly inflammatory. They're very high in omega-6 fatty acids, which are pro-inflammatory, whereas grass-fed beef and some of these others are much higher in omega-3. Fish oil is another good example.
And what about beans? Beans are carbohydrates and proteins.
Yeah, that's what they are, carbohydrates and proteins. So listen, there's, or an apple, if you want to talk about an apple. On their own, there's nothing wrong with these things. You're not going to look at it and say, well, you should never eat that. That's unhealthy. But we're talking about how you constitute the bulk of what you're going to be eating.
Mm-hmm.
So beans do have protein in them. Now, remember, beans as they exist, the little husk, they actually have, you could not eat raw beans. They're poisonous.
Yeah.
You have to boil them and remove that, soften them essentially. But the problem with beans is, even though they have good protein, they're very high in carbohydrate, and a lot of that carbohydrate is in the form of starch. So that will raise your blood sugar. Now, do they have fiber? Yes, but you can get fiber from other sources. If you look at an apple, well, an apple, I like to talk about apples because, everybody likes apples, and there's the old adage, I'm sure they have it in Spain too, an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Yes.
And I'm sure in Ireland it's much more poetic than that. But an apple, if you think about what a fruit is not something that's been designed by plants to make humans healthy. A fruit is something that plants have evolved to have that will get animals to eat them. And the way you get animals to eat them is you put sugars in there. And so, and then what we've done with agriculture is we've modified these, and it's genetically modified, yes, through interbreeding and so on. But we've created these apples. They're nothing like a wild apple. They're super sweet. And they have these names like Honey Crisp. And, they're just these super sweet. And so those aren't like a real natural apple anyway. And yes, they have some fiber in them, some soluble fiber, and they have some vitamins. But it's really just a big sugar bomb. There's so much sugar in there that, again, that will spike your blood sugar. Not as much maybe as just eating starch. So I limit that. I do eat fruit. I eat typically a handful of berries a day, strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and that's because they have these phytochemicals in there that are really very beneficial. But I don't eat a lot of other fruit. My wife and I, we'll buy an apple, and we'll share like a quarter of an apple. We'll have like a slice. We treat it like candy, right? Maybe after dinner, a little slice of apple or something in the morning. So beans, really, for a ketogenic diet, by the way, a lot of people think ketogenic diets are carnivore diets, that you only eat bacon and eggs and meats. You can be vegan on a ketogenic diet. It's challenging, and you'll probably have to eat a lot of soy. By the way, soy is one bean that's very high in protein and low in starch. So soybeans are kind of okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we have green and yellow beans, those string beans, those are okay too. But the other beans you're talking about, and legumes and pulses, those are going to be very high in starch. So you can't eat those and also be ketogenic. And I'm not sure if we'll have time today, but I'm happy to talk about it. The benefits of a ketogenic diet are not just through the reduction of the carbohydrate effects on your metabolism, but also the very beneficial effects of the ketones that are produced. So we call it ketogenic.
Mm-hmm.
So the genic comes from Genesis, which is from the Bible, which means creation, right? So it's not from the Bible, but same thing. It means creation. So ketogenic diets means creation of ketones. And ketones are created when we burn fats instead of carbohydrates. So when you stop eating carbohydrates, you still need blood sugar, but your liver can do that. Your liver and your kidneys happily make that through a process called gluconeogenesis, which means making new glucose from non-glucose sources. So there's no problem there. But when you burn fats, you produce these ketones as a byproduct. And these are very powerful. They're energy molecules that can be burned. So they're almost like a fourth kind of macronutrient. They'd probably fit best into the fat category, but they can be burned, and they're burned very efficiently, and they burn with much less oxidative stress and much less inflammatory impact. In fact, your brain will prefer to use ketones. The main one is called beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. And your brain will prefer that over the glucose. It can't use proteins and fats. Your other tissues are pretty flexible, in particular your heart is, but even your heart will choose to use ketones first. So it's an energy fuel. It's also a powerful signaling molecule, like a hormone. And one of the things it does is help to mediate the inflammatory response, this innate immune response. And so there's a number of recent studies that have come out in the past few months to demonstrate how the ketones produced in ketogenic diets help to moderate the response to exposure to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19, by mediating the inflammatory response. In other words, you don't get that cytokine storm. And in fact, there's even evidence to suggest that the ketones prevent the virus from actually finding these ACE2 receptors, these they're called angiotensin converting enzyme 2. That's the receptor that the virus uses to get in the cell. So it downregulates those receptors, so there's fewer receptors on the cells. And then even when it gets in the cells, it downregulates the inflammatory response within the cell. And then it also helps to prevent those cells from popping, something called apoptosis, which is the cells pop when they get full of virus, and then that spreads again. Mm-hmm. So these are all very new. They're sort of just in the hypothesis stage, but good evidence to suggest that ketogenic diets may be a very effective prophylactic measure to prevent you from getting COVID-19. But if you do get it, it's very likely to reduce or mitigate the effects of COVID-19, which means you won't end up in the hospital and you won't end up on a respirator, and hopefully, you won't pass away. And I know you've had, terrible experience with that in Spain and throughout Europe. And we're seeing that south of the border in the United States too. So, and then you think about the economic costs of that too. When you look at the whole picture, if we could convince our policymakers to suggest people might want to look at their diets and stop eating all of this high glycemic index food that's aggravating the obesity, aggravating the insulin resistance, aggravating the inflammation, we could go a long way towards mitigating the whole global response to COVID.
Yeah, if we had more information about nutrition and how people can take responsibility for their own health, we would be a good policy if they really care about people's health.
Well, I don't think they don't care. I think it's just, typically science will lead policy by about 15 years. Mm-hmm. And we first started to realize that, cholesterol in your diet doesn't really affect heart disease, saturated fats in your diet. We've known that now for about 15 years. So it's time, I think, for the policymakers to listen. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons I wrote Biodiet here, the book with my wife, Dale Drury, she's the co-author, and she's a journalist, so she helped me get the tone right so it's more engaging and entertaining, was to give people that important information that they can make a change in their lives, and that change can come quite quickly. You have time to make that positive change to your diet that will help not only help with COVID, but also help improve your overall health and that of your family. So the book is written so that first it tells you why, like we've been talking about, and then the second half is how, and it's how to adopt a ketogenic diet safely with your physician's guidance, and how to avoid some of those side effects that some people experience early on that they call the keto flu, and then how to maintain that change in lifestyle. I've been keto for about 8 years now, and I haven't had as much as a sniffle for 8 years. So, touch wood, right? But I don't get anything anymore. And I'm exposed to it like anybody else is, but I give that to the ketogenic diet. I personally lost, and I was in good shape. I had no health issues when I started this about 10 years ago. And I guess about 8 years ago. And I lost about 27 pounds of mid-abdominal body fat. And I lost that within about 12 weeks. But I never had any other real health issues. Like I didn't have any hyperglycemia or any blood pressure issues or anything. So I was in good health already, but I like to think I'm in even better health. I mean, there's good health and then there's optimal health, right?
Yes.
And one of the ways you know that you're in optimal health is you just don't get infectious diseases when they come around, because your immune system is optimized, and you recover from injury quicker, and you feel you have more energy, and you sleep better, and all of these other things that people experience when they've adopted a ketogenic diet. There's sort of for some people, there's kind of an aha moment where their body suddenly switches to producing these ketones, and it gets in their brain as a fuel. And my friends jokingly call it the Harper high. They said, I just woke up one day and I just felt fantastic. And of all the people I've counseled over the years on ketogenic diets, that's the one completely consistent thing. Not everybody loses weight necessarily. Not everybody improves their health conditions as much as they can. Most people do, but everyone says they just feel fantastic. And some people say, I haven't felt this way in 10 years, right?
Yes.
So that's when you know you're in good health. So in those that acts of illness, like, you know when you're obese, right? Because you can stand in a mirror and turn sideways and tell if you're obese or not. How do you know if you're inflamed? Well, you hurt, you know, you look very young, but you know, I'm a little older, you know, what happens as you get older is you start hurting more, and that's that inflammation that's building up in your system, systemic inflammation we call it. And so what happens after you adopt a ketogenic diet is you just hurt less. And then what about insulin resistance? Well, the best way I've found, I mean, you can measure your blood sugar, but just in your own personal life, it's that kind of brain fog. When you start getting that brain fog, as you get older, you know, a little bit of mild cognitive impairment, perhaps, that's something that can suddenly change when you adopt a ketogenic diet. One woman I was counseling said, it's like you pulled cotton wool out of my brain that's been there for 10 years, and I'm thinking clearly for the first time. So that's a sign. If you have that brain fog and can't remember things and so on, that's a sign that you're probably insulin resistant. And as I mentioned earlier, with Alzheimer's, we now also think of that, some of us, as a type 3 diabetes. It's an insulin resistance of the brain. So if you're feeling that brain fog, that means your brain is becoming insulin resistant, and that can lead to Alzheimer's disease. It's certainly inflammatory, which can lead to all kinds of problems. So that can be reversed with the ketones on a ketogenic diet.
And your book is a 12 weeks program?
Yeah, I'd recommend 12 weeks. I mean, you know, it's all kind of arbitrary, but it takes, I like to ease people into the transition because, you know, what a lot of people do, you were quite right when you said people come to anything with diet in the word ketogenic diet because they want to lose weight. So probably more than 95% of people have heard that ketogenic diets are the most effective way to lose body fat, and they are. That's why so many actors and athletes and so on have adopted them. It is the best way. So then what they do, they just turn to the internet and they look at some video, and, you know, I don't know where they're getting that information from. It's certainly not done safely if they're not consulting with their physician. So that's why I suggested that. So we ease people in over a few weeks, and it's a bit arbitrary. Take some sugar out of their diet, then take some carbs out of their diet, add in some more water and maybe something called MCT oil, which is like a coconut derivative that converts completely into ketones. So people get used to that. It's all in the early chapters. We also tell them the kinds of measurements that they should take, both themselves and in consultation with their physician in their blood work. So they have that benchmark they can measure back to. And then if you look at the sort of psychology of human behavior, you have to keep doing something for about 42 days, about 6 weeks to develop new habits. So if you ease in for a few weeks and then you do that for another few weeks, and then a lot of clinical studies run 12 weeks. So it allows you to compare your results to those clinical studies. But that's like, 12 weeks, it's a quarter of a year, it's one season. So it's an arbitrary but pretty useful length of time, but at least, a couple of months. The other thing, Carmen, is that people shouldn't cycle on and off of this. This is, you can't do a ketogenic diet halfway because you won't get yourself into nutritional ketosis. You won't be producing those ketones. So you have to kind of go all in. And it's not intended to be something that you do just to, lose some weight to look good in your wedding dress or on the beach or something like that. This is intended to be a permanent lifestyle change. And so, once through 12 weeks, then you're buying new foods, you're having new recipes, you're preparing new kinds of foods at home, you're finding ways to eat out and eat keto. And one of the great things about the popularity of ketogenic diets, and I think it's the most Googled word in nutrition, is keto, right? Or ketosis. Is that now, like a few years ago, I go into a restaurant and say, well, I'm a keto guy, and they would have no idea what that is. Now I can go anywhere in the world pretty much, and it's not they recognize me, it's that they understand what keto is, right? They understand the word, they don't necessarily know what it is, because sometimes they'll order keto in a restaurant and the stuff I get is just like, I don't know what you were thinking of. And they'll say, well, it's gluten-free. And I go, well, ketogenic diets are gluten-free, but not everything gluten-free is ketogenic. That's quite a different thing. So we need to educate people. Yes, for sure. And that's why Dale and I wrote Biodiet. It's for the lay person to understand the benefits, understand how to do it. And so in a method that's not too science intensive, that they can really engage with and enjoy.
So basically a keto diet is eating more vegetables, but vegetables, especially green vegetables, and with low carbohydrates, so no potatoes, or pumpkin.
Yeah. Well, we eat a little bit of squash,
Squash,
summer squash and so on. Zucchini is pretty good. In the back of our book, we have a list of all the vegetables. So here's what you eat on a ketogenic diet. Basically, no processed food, unless you consider wine and cheese to be processed, because I do eat wine and cheese. Wine's fairly low. I don't drink beer anymore. I used to love beer, but that's very high in carbs. They do have some low carb beers, but they're just dreadful. So we drink wine in moderation, of course, and then cheese, and then all manner of dairy, if you can tolerate that. A lot of eggs. We eat probably a couple of dozen eggs a week between the two of us. But when we eat, we'll get if we're eating beef, which we don't eat that often. Like last night we had chicken livers, which was much more, and we eat a lot of fish. But a little piece of beef like that's maybe 6 ounces, we'll actually split that. So I think beef is a very healthy thing to eat, but again, in moderation. You don't need to eat a 16-ounce steak. Like that's not going to make you any healthier, right? And then the rest of what we'd eat would look like pretty much everyone else. We just wouldn't have the potatoes, we wouldn't have the starch, we wouldn't have the bread, we wouldn't have the rice. So, and as you mentioned, nothing that grows below the ground, because that's where plants store their carbohydrates as starch. So no potatoes and beets and things like that. Beet greens would be fine. Anything that grows above the ground that's not a grain or a bean or a fruit, aside from the fruits I mentioned earlier, berries, then you'd avoid that. But all the other leafy greens and peppers and tomatoes and avocados and all that sort of thing, that's most of what we eat, actually. So, and I eat a lot of nuts. A lot of nuts are very good as well. And listen, that's a great thing. Nuts are just, they're the perfect food probably for humans is an egg, because, the chicken has more or less the same tissues as humans do. They're animal tissues aside from the feathers, which are kind of like hair. But everything in a chicken comes in an egg. I mean, the egg doesn't eat anything. It's got almost no carbohydrate in there. So, but it comes out with all those healthy tissue types. So an egg is probably the perfect human food if you can tolerate them. The plant version of that would be a nut, right? Like walnuts and macadamia. So those nuts are kind of the plant version of an egg. That's where the endosperm and the ovary is, and so on. So I eat a lot of nuts, and they're a great thing that you can just carry around for snacks. Some nuts just because they're very dense in energy and they're very satisfying.
And be careful with we have to be careful with the fats, because they're like fats that are not very good, like omega-6, because they cause inflammation, right?
Yeah, so I don't really eat anything that has a lot of that. But if you look at let's say we take a standard diet that's 2,000 calories a day, and if you wanted to be ketogenic, you would need to get about roughly, let's say 70% of your calories from fat. And let's say, I don't want you to do this, but let's say you decided I'm going to get all of those 70% of my daily calories from fat. How much olive oil would that be? And it seems like you'd have to drink like a bottle of olive oil, but it's actually only about 2/3 of a cup. That would provide 1,400 calories of very good monounsaturated fat. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody just drink 2/3 of a cup of oil during the day, but you can certainly put lots of grass-fed butter and oil on the foods that you eat, those vegetables and things, and then avoid those seed oils. And they're usually the seed oils. If you want to see a refined food, go and look at a seed oil refinery, right? It's unbelievable. It looks like an oil. It looks like, a petroleum oil refinery. It's crazy. So those are really, really ultra processed foods. And most people in the West, they're eating at least 50% of their calories are from ultra processed foods, which are uniformly bad for you. So just getting, if people just get sugar out of their diet and get processed food out of their diet and And all those sweetened drinks, and that includes orange juice and all those other fruit juices that are, even if they're naturally sweetened, it doesn't matter. They're still loaded with sugar. So we just get those out of our diet, and then add in these healthy, organic foods and fish and vegetables and nuts. You're going to be better for it, and you're going to notice that pretty quickly. Yeah.
And if we reduce the processed foods, we'll reduce most of the bad fats and.
Yep. That's where we get most of it. Yeah. Most of the, salt, sugar, and bad fat comes in processed food. And it's a good point, because the food industry is the biggest transactional business on the planet. Like the most valuable business, of course, would be real estate, I guess, but it's bigger than the oil industry, because everybody has to eat food all the time. I mean, and a lot of that, about half of it, about $3 trillion a year globally, is processed food. And there's about 12 companies that control almost all of the processed food on the planet. And you probably recognize all their names. And I can tell you, they're not really interested in our health. They're interested in their bottom line. And I'm not just, this isn't a conspiracy theory. They design food that tastes good so we can't stop eating it. So here we have government policy that tells us to eat food that's making us fat. And then we have this processed food industry that sells us food that we can't stop eating because it tastes so good. And we have an obesity and diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular, and we wonder why.
Yes.
And this is why. And what people can learn from adopting a ketogenic diet is they can get much more satisfaction from a ketogenic diet, because all of the taste and flavor and things is in the fats, other than salt and sugar, it's in the fats. So it's really quite a satisfying diet once you've adapted to it.
And then we won't have the cravings that we have when we eat processed foods and sugar and.
Now, some people do have cravings in the first couple of weeks, which is part of this transition phase. And, if you really if you have a sweet tooth, as we say, and you really like sugar, you can get, they have diabetic foods that are candies made with sort of artificial sweeteners. We talk about them in our book. There's different types. Some of them are called sugar alcohols, which are neither sugars nor alcohols, and they metabolize to some degree, things like xylitol and erythritol and so on. These are natural compounds, but they taste sweet. And then there's the artificial ones. I'm not a big fan of the artificial ones. I just think there's other options there. But what happens when you adapt is, I've had people saying, well, I didn't think I could ever live without bread. And now I'm finding I don't even think about it. And what I notice with the sweet stuff is, because I don't eat much sweet stuff, is if I eat something that the average, person would buy, like a cookie or something, it just tastes so sweet to me. It's just cloyingly sweet, and I can't stomach it. So you don't need as much to have the same level of satisfaction.
And can you use stevia as a sweetener?
Sure, you can use stevia. That's another natural. There's stevia, there's monk fruit. There's a number of them. And I would just say, use it all in moderation. One of the things that I see, because I'm obviously been invited onto a whole bunch of groups that are keto websites and Facebook and so on, I see a lot of people that are sharing dessert recipes. Like they're just all dessert recipes, cakes and cookies. These are all keto cakes and keto and all. And I just go, well, I don't think that's a good way to go. So, you're talking about changing your diet to make it healthier. And then what you're going to do is fill up on calories, and they may be ketogenic, but it's still dessert. I mean, what we should be focusing on is just healthy farm raised food, that's raised in a sustainable and way that respects, animal rights and so on. And we can do that. And that's the better way for the planet, I think, both environmentally and in terms of human health too. But I'm really a health expert, not so much an environmental expert, although I know enough biology that I know a thing or two. And that may be a discussion for another day. But I think the general take-home message, I guess, too, is what you're saying earlier, is food can be medicine if you eat the right diet, or it can be poison if you eat the wrong diet. And what I would ask people to do is don't pay much attention to, because the food industry pays a lot of experts to tell you things so that you'll buy their food. look at evidence-based randomized controlled trials. Don't look at these epidemiological studies that ask people 2 years after the fact how many eggs they ate or all those sorts of observational studies. Look at the cellular and molecular mechanisms behind this. And I think if you do that, you'll realize that we now have really good, robust science that indicates the therapeutic benefits for ketogenic diets.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the other thing I was going to mention too, sorry, not meaning to be self-promoting, but I will be for a moment. The Biodiet book, so it's only available in North. We actually sold out 4 times. I didn't realize how popular it was going to become. We kept the price as low as possible. We're not looking, we don't make much money out of it, about $1 a book. So we're not getting rich on this, but I wanted to get the message out to as many people. So we kept the cost low. It's self-published, but it's a very well-produced book. But in Ireland, I mean, you can order it, on online ordering, and they'll ship it from North America. But it's also available as an ebook, so anybody can download it as an ebook. And we also, my wife and I, do the reading. We did an audio book too. So on any of the channels that offer ebooks or audiobooks, you can download it and have a look. And we have a website, biodiet.org. So biodiet, all one word, .org. And on there, Dale, it has, if you go into the resources tab and you look at the articles and studies, we've compiled, my wife has compiled hundreds and hundreds of studies, and they're not necessarily the primary research, because that's often very dense for readers to understand. So it's the reports on those from credible organizations like the Guardian newspaper, or the Washington Post or the New York Times, or MedNet, or any of the Health Daily, or any of the good credible online websites. So we have hundreds of things, and what she's done, as well as she's in capital letters, anything that relates to the COVID pandemic is done in capitals there. So people can go and have a look at the evidence for themselves. And I think if they do, they'll see there's mountains of growing evidence to indicate the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets.
And how people can download the book? How people can buy the digital?
Yeah, if they go to the website, there's links there. But as I mentioned, you can go on. I won't mention any names, but your favorite online bookstore, whatever it is, it's available through all of them. But if you go to our website, I think at the bottom of the page there, you'll see links to all those, both the audiobook and the ebook and the hardcover book too.
So how people can find you in your website, by biodiet.org?
Yeah, biodiet.org. Yep.
And do you have also Facebook group?
Yeah, if they want to find me on Facebook, it's always a good idea to mention that, you heard me on your podcast. It's I think on Facebook I'm Dave Harper, and on LinkedIn I'm David G. Harper. So David G. Harper is kind of my professional name, but I post on both of those. I post a lot of the latest research, so people can come and find me there. They can also, if they like to send me an email on our biodiet.org website, you can just link to contact us there too.
I think it would be great to have like an online course with the information that you have in the book.
Well, yeah, I just finished developing a nutrition course for that. It's a 2nd-year course, but that's my plan, is to develop a 4th-year course. Exactly that. So great minds think alike, I guess, Carmen. Yeah, I'd very much like to do that. In fact, the Institute of Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition, which I'm a member of, they're developing some courses around that too. But that's I'm not sure if they're delivered online, or I guess everything's online these days. But and I think Tim Noakes, Noakes, there's a Tim Noakes Institute, I think. They offer a 40-hour course in ketogenic diets as well.
Yeah, because it's important for people to know how they can do a good ketogenic diet, because it could be good or bad depending on how you...
Oh yeah, and there's different types, So,
yes, different types.
Not all ketogenic diets are low carbohydrate, but not all low carbohydrates are ketogenic. So the famous paleo diet is not a ketogenic diet. And that's exactly why we wrote the book, so that they would know how to call it. So the words to look for are a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So that's the appropriate diet for the majority of people. There are some other therapeutic diets that have slightly different ratios of macronutrients and so on. But the term well-formulated ketogenic diet, that means you're getting all of the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and even fiber I talk a lot about the fiber in our book too. It's easy to get without getting the starch that goes with it. So that's all. I would like to think that the easiest first source for that would be the book Biodiet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, David.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great talking to you and to meet you. And we'll keep in touch. And if you have any follow-up questions, please get in touch with me. And for those people listening to your podcast, go ahead and go to biodiet.org, and you can send me an email if you have any follow-up questions.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful for having you here. And I really enjoyed today. And for the listeners, go and check David's website and find him on Facebook or Instagram. And by
I
the
should
book,
mention,
yes.
sorry, we do have I'm not a huge social media guy, but our handle, the hashtag is Biodiet Book, all one word. So it's hashtag Biodiet Book for Instagram and Pinterest and all those other ones.
Oh, great. That's good to know. And if you want to listen more episodes on health, consciousness, and self-development, you can check our website, the floweroflifepodcast.com. Thank you, and talk to you next episode.